Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, and we are talking all about The Shining today. The book first came out January 28th, 1977, so we're still in the 70s here, but this is one of those books that sort of really put Stephen King into the horror genre in a way that I think even Carrie and Salem's Lot hadn't reached just yet. And to talk about the book with me today is Mirjani Rawls. He is back. We talked about Carrie before. How are you feeling about talking about The Shining today?
Hi, everybody. I'm back. Good. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the movie. It's a classic horror tale and whatnot, but the book is a little different. Like the book is actually like there's a lot more layers to the book than I usually thought, and I really liked it. And yeah, I'm ready to talk about it.
For me, this was one of the first few books that I read from Stephen King. I had dabbled here and there with a couple other books before this, but it was in college when I was like, okay, I really want to start reading more of his books just because there have been so many adaptations and everything. And while my mom had the book at home, I was in Philly. So I was like, all right, I guess I'm downloading like a PDF of this and reading it on my computer, which is not the best reading experience, but I got it done. And it's one of those books that really sticks with you too. And thankfully, I read the book before going back and watching the movie, I believe. But it was one of those things where I had known about the movie for a long time because it's, this iconic role from Jack Nicholson. And that's something we are going to be talking about in a later episode. But for the book, I was like, okay, I see why maybe Stephen King wasn't too thrilled with the Stanley Kubrick adaptation because it is quite a bit different. And we're going to go ahead and jump right in to the plot here. This setting for this book is fantastic. You have the Overlook Hotel, and it was inspired by the Stanley Hotel, which is in Colorado. So you have this mountainy area where it does snow heavily, and that's the backdrop for this. And it's in the off season. So we have these characters who are at this hotel pretty much by themselves for the entirety of the book. And it's just one of those things where you know right away, just from the setting, that he's going to do something good with this story.
Yeah, because I think some of it originated because Stephen King and his wife stayed at the Stanley Hotel by themselves in
Right.
like 1974. So, and then he stayed in room 217, which he said was haunted. Yeah, it's kind of like, well, I mean, obviously, like this didn't happen to Stephen King. Like he didn't
Right.
turn to like a murderous rampage or whatnot. But it was cool how he's kind of like pieced that together from staying from there, and then he read Ray Bradbury's The Veld. The Veld is like about a person who would dream things and they would become real. So like he had like drawn that all together, and it's The Shining's about basically a story about a small family, and then how like their problems, well, yeah, their problems like manifest into like some sort of isolationism, like. Like, can you imagine like staying by yourself with no other human interaction other than, like your husband or your wife and your kid for like a long duration of time and just, you know what I mean? And just, that's just kind of you. Of course, like things would kind of play around in your head and whatnot. You would get cabin fever. That's basically what happened. But like, there's a supernatural element to it, which actually like which I liked about the book more. Like if you see the movie, like it doesn't really go into it that much, but
Right.
the book does. Like there's like a lot of stuff with Jack, especially that kind of gets there. You see more of it in the book. Like this guy has issues. This guy has really deep rooted issues from his childhood, and like especially with I think the family that stayed before them, Grady, who like killed his wife and two young daughters and whatnot. Like you kind of see it going that route.
Exactly. Plus, the history of the hotel sticks with it. you have all of these ghosts, and it's not just one. There are multiple rooms and multiple corridors and everything that have these weird things going on. And you have Jack Torrance, who is hoping to write a play while he's there because, as we've heard between musicians and writers, they tend to like to go to these places that are pretty solitary. And, many writers or musicians will go rent cabins in the woods or even buy their own cabins so they can have this sort of place to just go get away and get some work done. But for Jack Torrance, because he's a recovering alcoholic and he has all of these anger issues, and then you have his son Danny, who ends up having these abilities come about while they're there, and it's just something that ends up being not what he was hoping for in the slightest, and he takes that out on both Wendy and Danny. And I think while the movie does a nice job of showing that anger and everything, like you said, the book has a lot more layers to it. And I think we get a better look at Danny too in the book. And you have Red Rum and all of these other things that have stuck with a lot of Stephen King fans over the years, or you see Red Rum, it's like you immediately know what it's referencing. And I think that's why The Shining sort of had an even bigger impact for Stephen King than, like I said, Carrie or Salem's Lot, because you'd probably be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't know about The Shining unless they possibly don't pay attention to pop culture at all.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Especially with Danny, there's a lot more layers to Danny in the book. Like, he's very aware that like Wendy, like his mom, Wendy and Jack are like going through some like marital issues. Like Jack is like a recovering alcoholic, and when Jack was young, like his father used to beat on his mother and stuff like that. So like with everything that Danny's experiencing, like it's not just one ghost that Danny sees. He sees a ton of them shits. And I think there's one point in the book where like they had a chance to leave, or like when he was leaving, but like Danny sees maybe like staying there as like a chance to like keep his family together. So he elects to stay even though like he's being haunted more so than anybody. And yeah, like I love that like there's kind of like these three-dimensional things with each of the characters, and especially with like the scenes with with Jack and Wendy later on that we'll talk about, like they're a lot more brutal. Like like Jack slowly unravels throughout the book. Like it like and then he slowly succumbs to whatever his childhood is, and then he starts like sympathizing with his father, which I was like, wow, all right, cool. Like that's it's crazy what isolation can do. And it's crazy like in isolation, especially with your addictions and vices, like you just kind of succumb to them and then you become the worst of yourselves. And that was like another layer other than the supernatural stuff that like I really liked about the book.
One of the other things that I really enjoyed about it was the fact that the Overlook really ends up being a character in itself in this novel, because you have the hotel trying to possess Danny, but because of Danny's powers, that proves to be harder than the hotel was anticipating. So then you have it try to do this to Jack, and Jack is obviously an easier target because while he might not want to think he's more vulnerable, he is because of his anger issues and being a recovering alcoholic. I feel like the hotel was like, okay, we can get this guy. And then you have Grady trying to convince Jack to kill Wendy and Danny, much in the way, like you said, he killed his daughter. So it's one of those things where, in the same way that Salem's Lot had the town really feel like a character, this has the hotel sort of give off that same feeling. And the hotel has a lot to do with propelling this story forward. If they weren't in the Overlook, this would be a very different story. But because you have, the haunted room, you have Grady, you have Danny's powers on top of that, it's like all of this stuff is just coming together in such a way to where you can tell this story in this manner.
Yeah, yeah, the Overlook on like when Halloran comes back, like it tells him to stay away, right? Like I think,
I think so. Well, the thing is, Danny's powers end up being so strong that he can get a message to Halloran, who's all the way in Florida, so he's going way across the country to get this message to Halloran. And I think, he sort of has this sense that he knows what happens in the hotel, but because it's the off season, he's trying to just enjoy his time in Florida and everything. And he pops up again in the epilogue too, which we'll talk about the ending a little bit later because I feel like endings with Stephen King novels are always interesting to talk about sort of by themselves. But yeah, it's with Halloran, it's interesting, and he still takes that chance too to try and save Danny and Wendy, and it's probably because he has a decent idea of what's going on.
yeah, Halloran was kind of. I felt like his character, especially like going with like saving the day, he was kind of like the bridge to basically kind of bring out Danny's gifts. Like you know what I mean? Like so, Danny's probably going along and like listening to people's like listening to people's minds and stuff like that. And then like he meets Haller and he's like, no, it's this. You know what I mean? Like you have a gift and like you're gonna need it because in the beginning of the book, like Danny's seeing all these images of I mean what is gonna happen later. So
Right.
yeah, he's like a good like he's Stephen King kind of does that in his books where like he has a character who like not really a narrator, but like kind of like he's kind of like a stand-in telling you like what's going on. You know what I mean?
Right. And with Halloran, it was actually the animal bushes and everything that started trying to attack him to keep him from kind of getting inside and getting Danny and Wendy to safety. But during that whole thing where Jack is pursuing Danny, you have this brief moment where the real Jack comes out and he tells Danny to run away before the hotel can sort of take control of Jack again and make him go crazy. And I think that was a nice touch in the book because obviously, you know, yes, Jack is abusive, but at the same time, I don't think he really wants to hurt his own son. But because of what the hotel is making him do, it's really hard to sort of see that fine line. And in that moment where he kind of pops out and tells Danny to run away, we get that. And it's like, okay, we've confirmed that Jack doesn't really want to have any of this happening, even though he is a recovering alcoholic and does have a temper. He's never really intentionally trying to get rid of his family, so to speak.
Yes, and then that same token, once he does that, he like bashes his face in with a mallet. So like it destroys like the last of what Jack is, and it metaphorically kills Jack, and then he becomes like the physical manifestation of the hotel, and then just kind of loses it, and then tries to like kill them and whatnot. So like, yeah, like you said, like that's a nice little touch there. But like, you always like reading the book. I always felt that like Jack was always going to kind of succumb to whatever the hotel was trying to do to him. Like, I didn't think that like there would be a happy end. I mean, there isn't one in the movie, but like it's even more tragic in the book because you have that little instance of like humanism that happens, whatnot. So like, yeah, poor old Jack, you know.
I really like how he moves this away from Maine too. I think that's another stark difference between The Shining and his first two books because even later on when we get to it and everything like that, you have these fictional towns in Maine that he's made up. You have Derry, you have Castle Rock, you have Jerusalem's Lot, and to have this take place elsewhere, I think it just really cements how different this story is compared to his other ones. Even though it is still a horror story, it's like, okay, he's moving away from these places that he's intensely familiar with. He's still living in Maine to this day, and it's obviously a place that he loves. But with this, him and his wife go stay at the hotel, and it serves as this inspiration for a totally different story. And I think that's something that, again, makes this one stand out, because you're like, okay, you know, this is so big in Stephen King lore that we're seeing it tie into something like Castle Rock today. And I think it'll really be interesting to see how many times this place ends up being visited, because we know that the sequel, Doctor Sleep, followed after this, and that came out much, much later. This came out in 1977 and Doctor Sleep came out in 2013. So that's a huge gap between references to The Shining and a sequel and everything like that. Most sequels will come out, a few years later. So just the fact that he has always had this sort of in the back of his mind, it seems, and the fact that it's being incorporated again into Castle Rock, I think it's just such a good use of this source material. And obviously, those other ones are something that I'll be diving into later. It'll be a while before I get to Doctor Sleep, but we'll get to it.
Well, at the end of the book, uh, Halloran, Wendy, and Danny like go to a resort in Maine because Halloran gets a job as a chef. So
Right.
it circles back to Maine. But like, think of the Colorado Rockies. Like, it's pure like Halloran needs like a snowblower to even get up to the hotel. It's a prime location for to be isolated and to not be around like any humans and not be able to go anywhere. Like you have to be there and stick and stay with your problems. Like there's no escape. And I think that's kind of like one of the main plot points of The Shining. This is just like the problems that, Wendy and Danny and Jack had in that small apartment that that they stayed in and stuff like that. It was right there to confront them right in the hotel. And no matter how big it was, those problems manifested and they kept on growing bigger and bigger. And it was different for everybody else. Like Jack, it was like his alcoholism in childhood. Danny, it was trying to control his gifts and like dealing with that and like dealing in a place where like it wasn't so friendly to him. And then Wendy, it was like trying to be a mother and then having your husband unravel and trying to navigate that and trying to stay alive, basically. So, yeah, it affects each character in a different way.
I'm glad that you mentioned the ending there, because we might as well go ahead and talk about that, and then we'll dive into the pacing of the story and some of our other thoughts on it. But, you know, you have this big, literally explosive ending at first where the Overlook is just completely destroyed. And that honestly felt like the only thing you could do in order to sort of break free from the grasp of the Overlook. And Jack dies in the process. And I think by the end of it, he knows that that's the right move, because as long as the hotel has a hold over him, he's going to be a danger to Wendy and Danny. And I think, having it just be this big explosion that comes from the boiler room, that almost feels like it could have been a perfect ending even without the epilogue, because like you said, the epilogue takes them to a year later, and they're staying with Halloran, who has this chef's job, like you said, in Maine. And while Stephen King still finds a way to get Maine into the story, it makes sense that we would want to see what happens. And maybe at the time he didn't know he would be writing Doctor Sleep all of these years later. And I just want to get your thoughts on which ending you would have preferred. Would you have preferred that it just sort of end with that big explosion and sort of this cliffhanger of an ending to where you don't really know what happens with Wendy and Danny? Or do you like that they added the epilogue in?
I guess the epilogue was cool. You know what I mean? Like, oh well, happily ever after, everybody is great. I
It's a tough one.
I think I would have liked it without the epilogue. because you assume that like Halloran, Danny, and Wendy get there anyway, but like with the whole like explosion and then that like hotel creature trying to like go back to the boiler room and whatnot, like I think I would have just preferred that ending. Like the epilogue was just too like, all right, here's a you know what I mean, everybody survives and here's a happy ending and whatnot like that. Like with how the book went, yeah, I think I just if he would just left the epilogue out, I would have been cool. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like so
same.
yeah, I'm gonna choose that.
The explosion feels like a much better way to end a horror novel. You know, with horror novels, we don't necessarily expect happy endings. At least I don't. You know, it's something where I'm like, okay, everyone is going to die. And obviously that's not the case with every single horror novel or movie or anything like that, but going in with that mindset and then sort of getting this epilogue ending, it's like, oh, okay. And the reason I'm focusing quite a bit on endings with this podcast is because people have varying degrees of opinions on how Stephen King ends his novels. And while I think, you know, the explosion would have been a better way to end this, I'm not overly upset that we have the epilogue. And, you know, when we spoke about Carrie, I think that ending was sort of fitting to see the government cover up and everything like that. It's like, okay, that kind of makes sense. We see how desolate that town is. And here it's like, oh, okay, they're in Maine. All right, cool. So we're back to Maine again, and here we are. And it's one of those things, like I said, we don't know when he planned on writing Doctor Sleep. I don't know if you would have that sequel in mind back in 1977 and wait, you know, 36 years to write it.
Yeah, I
That's a
don't.
long gap. So I don't know if that was something that sort of just developed later over the years as, you know, The Shining continued to grow in popularity and sort of just stick with people throughout all of these years, because the movie, Stanley Kubrick's movie, is one that people still talk about today as, you know, like one of the best horror movies. And while it is different, it's one of those things where you're like, okay, obviously the source material had something going for it. So maybe it's worth exploring it again. And I get the feeling that's more so what happened. But yeah, I just really enjoy this book overall.
No, especially with Danny's story and Powers, like Doctor Sleep actually like you could kind of develop a sequel off it because there's so much you can do with that, you
Right.
know? It's just that it felt like with the epilogue, he's like, I gotta get Maine in here somehow.
Yeah.
I gotta.
It felt a little forced.
Yeah, it was like he was like, all right, man, like, listen, somehow I gotta plug Maine in here. So let me just do this epilogue, and that's kind of how it felt like. And like you said, like I don't know if he really like foresaw that, like, all right, I'm gonna do a sequel to this. You know what I mean? Like I don't really know about, but like, yeah, I I was just cool with like a horror ending. Like it felt like, all right, well, I guess they got to survive somehow. They escaped. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then he could have just picked off with Doctor Sleep and whatnot. And like you said, like with Carrie, like when we talked about Carrie, like it made sense. Like there's another person with Carrie's abilities out there. You know what I mean? Like and the whole like sci-fi government thing. I get that. That's cool. You know, but like the whole like, well, you know, they're in Maine and Halloran's a chef. Like, all right, like they just went through like basically almost dying in the hotel, either by Jack or by the damn hotel itself, like making things come to life. So like, yeah, like I would prefer that like poltergeist like ending where you know the house eats itself and then the family just goes and like stays at a hotel and the credits roll.
I know what you mean. What do you think of the pacing of the book? Because obviously, once they get to the Overlook, it's not like all of this stuff starts happening right away. There is this build up to it. And I think that works well with the story because it's like, okay, we know this is where they're going. They're going to be here all winter, and they don't bombard you with everything all at once. They give you a little bit at a time, and then it all accumulates and gives you this big ending prior to the epilogue, that is. And I think that was really nicely done. And even though, the hardcover edition of the book is about 450 pages, I have no clue what my PDF was because it's a PDF and those pages are larger than book pages. But it's one of those things where, while it's over 400 pages, I don't really think it ever felt like it was that long of a book. And we know Stephen King books can get very long and some can feel very long, but I don't think that was the case with this one necessarily.
Yeah, like you said, there are a lot of chapters in this book. There's like over 50, but
Right.
it's in sections, like closing day and the wasp's nest and stuff like that. It felt like an episodal like TV show. Like you're like going, it's slowly building up to whatever the conclusion is. Like I felt more invested because like everything with Jack didn't really happen at once. You know what I mean? Like it was a slow build to his madness, and then I kind of got why he went mad and his history and what he had to deal with, and then like when he succumbed to it, like especially like his journey is like the evil had taken over him so bad that like he's like, you know what, I get why my dad beat my mom. You're like, what the hell? Like really? Like so it wasn't like human Jack anymore and whatnot. And I liked it. Yeah, I liked it. Like I if it was just like 200 and something page book where it's just like, all right, well, they stayed in the hotel and some stuff happened, and then everybody like Jack died, and then blah blah blah. Like I would have been like, all right, cool. Like it's a cool story, but the fact that Stephen King kind of plotted it out and like started at, um, you know, Jack talking to the hotel owner and kind of dismissing all the history, you start to see, all right, well, if he would have did this, this wouldn't have happened. Or like, with the hotel history happening here, and it gives you it in little pieces, like you know what I mean? Like, oh, well, this ghost happens because this happened in 1940 or whatnot. You know what I mean? Like it was kind of cool to see all that unravel.
Absolutely. Well, I think we can move on to discussing some of our favorite moments and everything from the book, because it's hard to think about this book and not sort of picture some of the moments from the movie. But I think with what the book was able to expand on more, because obviously, when you have a book being adapted, not every single thing from the book is going to wind up in a movie. And I think just the extra detail in the book was really nicely done. And obviously, as people can probably tell from listening to this, I'm a huge fan of what he did with the hotel and making it really feel like a character. And if he didn't make that work in the way he did, I don't think this book would have been as enjoyable as I thought it was.
I'm a huge fan of that. I'm a huge fan of like the slow hauntings, like especially with the wasp's nest
Right.
that happens. Like Jack gets stung, and then he has that flashback, and then he's like, "Oh, this would be cool for Danny." And then all of a sudden, Danny's getting crawled by wasps. I thought that was cool. I like the. I'm a huge horror fan, so I like the room 217 stuff. Uh, First, Danny experiences it, and then like Jack goes, and then like it takes him over to the two, and then I like especially because I'm a huge fan of the movie, but like I like how the ending happened here. You know what I mean? Like I like that it was in more detail. I like that um, that typewriter scene and whatnot. It's less emphasis on Jack being a writer and then Jack just kind of being broken. And I like that about the book. Like it's more that like Jack came there kind of like down on his luck and or whatnot, and Danny kind of assumes the responsibility of trying to do whatever he can in a kid way to like keep his family together. And I'm like, wow, like you know what I mean? Like there's, I guess there's like he's like wise beyond his years and whatnot, and I really like that role and how Danny is even more important in the novel than I guess in the movie. Yeah.
I honestly think Danny is probably my favorite character in the novel too, because you get so much more with him. And I think the reason behind that is, in a book, you don't have a child actor literally trying to memorize all these big words and these big lines and everything like that. So it's easier to portray children differently in a book because you don't have to rely on them actually being able to do these things. So it's one of those things where the book just goes so much deeper with Danny, and you know there are ties to The Haunting of Hill House, which ironically is out the day we're recording this on Netflix. And you know you see that influence throughout this. And I'm going to be reading The Haunting of Hill House soon and watching the show. So I don't have any direct correlations on my mind right now since I have yet to do that. But, by the time everyone is listening to this, of course, I will have done that by now since we're recording so far in advance here. But just to see that Stephen King is pulling from sort of these big, iconic horror stories, Shirley Jackson is a big name, Edgar Allan Poe, even Richard Matheson, and just being able to sort of take those influences and stick them in a character like Danny, I think that really goes to show how much of an effort Stephen King puts into the children in his novels. Carrie wasn't exactly a child, but she was high school age. You have the kids in It that have this huge focus on them. And I think it's interesting the way he chooses to write children. And that's sort of what makes Danny really stand out in this book.
Well, I one of Stephen King's pillars is to read more than you write. So like I could see that like he takes different influences and are able to make it his own. The thing you said about it, like the Losers Club, they are well. If you read the story, and there's some instances in the story. I mean, like I'm glad they cut them out the movie, thank God. But they're very adult and like
Right.
and a lot of kids in his stories, there's always like a coming of age type thing going on with them.
He doesn't
Whether
feel the
it
need to treat the kids like kids. And I think that sort of helps build up these characters down the line. And, we definitely see that when he returns to these characters in Doctor Sleep, which again, I still need to read. This whole thing is a very, very long process here. But, The Shining is such great solid ground to sort of build up these characters, especially Danny, that it's one of those things where I'm like, yes, I'm very excited to check out Doctor Sleep and see what he did.
yeah, it's kind of like Firestarter and stuff like that. He always gives if he's not giving kids like wisdom or something like that, he's always given them some type of power. Like a lot of kids like have like these like difficult backgrounds. I mean, look at fucking Carrie. Like Carrie is basically she has a mom who didn't really want her, who is super religious and doesn't allow her to do anything. So she has like telekinesis to cope. He always kind of makes kids almost superhero-ish, but there's always a flip side to it. There's always something that they have to overcome. And I always loved that about his novels. Like you know what I mean, like you said, like he doesn't baby kids. Like he has them go through a lot of heavy stuff. I mean, like we said, look at it. They have to go through a damn manifestation of evil. like,
Exactly. Well, do you have any final thoughts on the book? Maybe a couple things we didn't quite touch on?
oh no, like I think we covered a lot of it. I'm glad I revisited the book again. I really do love it. Of course, like a lot of people think about the film, but like really, if you have time, like read the book. Like there's a lot more layers to it. There's a lot more layers to uh, the characters, and then like what we have to do, we have to read Doctor Sleep next. So yeah,
Exactly. Well, Marjani, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. And for those of you listening, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram. We're going in chronological order. So, like I said, we have a while before Doctor Sleep comes up.
yeah,
The 36 years is There's a lot of Stephen King material in that
Yeah.
time period, to say the least. And, we haven't even hit the 80s yet, which is where I feel like things really start to ramp up with him as far as cranking out the novels, getting all of these adaptations going. And it's crazy. We are having a lot of fun so far doing this, though.
Yeah, definitely.
And of course, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
See you.